They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but for Maria, it was about to become a 5-course meal of justice that would shake the foundations of Manhattan's elite society. The crystalline chandeliers of Le Chateau sparkled overhead as she navigated between tables. The annual Winter's Foundation Charity Gala was in full swing, a sea of designer gowns and tailored suits filling the restaurant's grand ballroom. But amid all this opulence, Maria felt invisible. Just another uniformed server blending into the background of New York's wealthiest gathering. That was until Richard Winters, the billionaire tech mogul himself, decided to make her visible in the worst way possible. His voice, sharp as a knife and twice as cruel, cut through the ambient chatter of the room. Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, deliberately extending his foot as Maria passed by his table. The inevitable happened in slow motion, her tray tilting, crystal glasses tumbling through the air, champagne creating a golden arc before drenching his Italian suit. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard rose from his chair, all 6 feet of entitled fury towering over Maria's trembling form. "Look at this mess," he announced to his thoroughly entertained dinner companion. "This is exactly why some people will always be serving others instead of sitting at the table. Tell me, dear, did you even finish high school? Or was that too ambitious for someone of your station?" Laughter rippled through the crowd as Maria's cheeks burned with humiliation. But behind her lowered eyes, something else was burning, a fire that had been smoldering for years, fed by countless similar moments of degradation and dismissal. What Richard couldn't see, what none of them could see, was that Maria wasn't just any waitress. She had secrets of her own, and a past that was about to collide with Richard's perfect world in ways that would make tonight's champagne spill look like a mere prelude to the storm that was coming. Little did Richard know that this moment of casual cruelty would be the catalyst for his own undoing, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose the rotting core beneath his golden empire. Maria's fingers clenched around the empty tray as she apologized mechanically. But her mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan that would make Richard Winters regret ever learning her name. In the kitchen's harsh fluorescent lighting, Maria's hands trembled as she loaded another tray, her co-worker Jasmine's concerned eyes following her every move. "You can't let him get to you like that," Jasmine whispered, her dark curls falling forward as she leaned in close. But Maria could still hear Richard's booming laughter echoing from the ballroom, could still feel the weight of hundreds of judgmental stares burning into her back. Through the kitchen's swinging doors, she caught glimpses of Richard holding court at his table, gesturing dramatically as he regaled his guests with what had surely become the evening's favorite entertainment. His piercing blue eyes occasionally swept the room, searching for her, hungry for another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. Each time the doors swung open, his voice carried through. "These people simply don't understand their place anymore." Mr. Chen, the elderly head chef who had mentored Maria for the past 5 years, pressed a glass of water into her hand. "Remember what I taught you," he murmured, his gentle brown eyes holding a wisdom earned through decades of similar struggle. "Sometimes the mighty fall hardest when they believe themselves untouchable." Maria's fingers tightened around the glass, remembering the USB drive hidden in her locker, the one containing information that could bring Richard's empire crashing down. From across the kitchen, James Parker, Richard's corporate advisory board member, watched the scene unfold with calculated interest. His perfectly tailored suit and sharp features marked him as one of them, but there was something different in his gaze, a hint of dissatisfaction, perhaps even rebellion. Maria had noticed how he clenched his jaw whenever Richard spoke, had caught the flash of disgust in his dark eyes during the champagne incident. As the evening wore on, Maria continued her duties with mechanical precision, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about the documents she'd discovered while cleaning Richard's private office after hours, about the offshore accounts and the mysteriously disappeared whistleblowers. She thought about her father, who had lost everything in one of Richard's hostile takeovers, and about the countless others whose lives had been crushed beneath the wheels of his ambition. The weight of the evidence she'd gathered over months of careful observation pressed against her consciousness like a physical burden. Tonight's humiliation wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been looked down upon, every worker who'd been treated as disposable. As she watched Richard raise another champagne toast with his perfectly manicured hands, Maria knew the time for serving in silence was over. The real service she could provide was justice, served cold and calculated, with a side of long overdue consequences. Richard's laughter faded into uncomfortable silence as Maria approached his table one final time that evening, her movements deliberate and measured. "Your check, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. His blue eyes barely registered her existence as he carelessly tossed his black American Express card onto her tray. "Try not to drop this one too, dear." He smirked, earning another round of titters from his sycophantic companion. In the back office, Maria's fingers flew across the card reader with practiced efficiency, but this time, she wasn't just processing a payment. Each swipe, each number entered, was another piece of her plan falling into place. James Parker materialized beside her, his presence unexpected but not unwelcome. "Quite a show Winters put on tonight," he remarked quietly, his dark eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the computer screen. "Shame about his upcoming board meeting. I hear there might be some unexpected revelations." Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the kitchen staff had begun their cleanup, Maria sat in her small apartment, her laptop casting a blue glow across her tired features. The USB drive hummed to life as she plugged it in, revealing folders upon folders of damning evidence. Emails about illegal wage practices, documentation of environmental violations, proof of systematic discrimination. All carefully collected over months of being invisible, of being nothing more than part of the background furniture to men like Richard Winters. Mr. Chen's words from years ago echoed in her mind as she began composing emails to select journalists. Patience is not about waiting, but about how you wait. She had waited, learned, and gathered. Now it was time to act. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as Jasmine's voice came through her phone's speaker. "Are you sure about this, girl? Once you hit send, there's no going back." Maria thought about the young busboy Richard had fired last week for speaking up about unsafe working conditions, about the single mother who'd lost her savings in one of his investment schemes, about her own father who had died believing he was a failure because of Richard's ruthless business tactics. Her decision crystallized like ice in her veins. "Some things," she replied to Jasmine, "are worth the risk." The first email went out at exactly midnight, a carefully crafted message to the city's most ruthless, investigative reporter, complete with irrefutable evidence of Richard's crimes. But this was just the beginning. Maria had learned from the best, after all. She had watched Richard destroy lives with surgical precision for years. Now she would use that same precision to dismantle his world, piece by carefully documented piece. As she finally lay down to sleep, her phone buzzed with a text from James Parker. "Board meeting moved up to tomorrow. Winters doesn't know what's coming." Maria smiled in the darkness. Neither did anyone else. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Winters' tower as Maria arrived for her second job, the cleaning position that had given her access to Richard's most closely guarded secrets. The lobby buzzed with unusual energy. Executives hurried through security with worried expressions, their phones pressed to their ears. The first article had dropped an hour ago, and already the vultures were circling. Through the service elevator's grimy windows, Maria watched James Parker stride purposefully through the executive floor, a thick folder tucked under his arm. His usual composure seemed slightly cracked, a hint of anticipation visible in his typically calculated demeanor. As she pushed her cleaning cart past the boardroom, she could hear raised voices behind the heavy oak doors. "This is preposterous," Richard's voice boomed, its usual smugness replaced by barely contained panic. "Who leaked these documents?" In the employee break room, Jasmine was already waiting with a cup of coffee and the morning's newspaper. "It's happening," she whispered, dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The headline screamed across the front page. Winter's empire built on corruption. Whistleblower reveals decades of systematic abuse. Maria's hands trembled as she took the paper, but not from fear, from the pure electric thrill of justice in motion. Mr. Chen appeared silently beside them, his weathered face bearing the ghost of a smile. "The mighty oak fears not the wind," he murmured, "until it realizes its roots are exposed." He placed a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder, his touch carrying the weight of understanding. He knew, of course, he had always known. His kitchen had been her sanctuary, his wisdom her guide through the darkest moments of her planning. The boardroom erupted again, voices carrying through the ventilation system. "Every document has been verified. The SEC is already involved." Maria continued her cleaning routine, invisible once more, but now by choice. Each swipe of her cloth, each piece of trash collected, brought her closer to the moment Richard's world would completely unravel. Her phone vibrated. Another reporter requesting comment. 3 more major news outlets had picked up the story. Social media was ablaze with accusations and revelations. Former employees stepping forward with their own stories of abuse and exploitation. The avalanche she had triggered was gaining momentum, growing beyond even her careful planning. Through the glass walls of his office, Maria watched as Richard's facade finally began to crack. His perfectly coiffed hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of emergency meetings. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city he had thought he owned, while his empire crumbled in real time on every news channel playing silently on the walls around him. For a moment, their eyes met in the reflection, hers steady, his wild with recognition and dawning horror. The insignificant waitress he had humiliated was the architect of his destruction. The secret smile that played across Maria's lips carried the weight of 1,000 served dishes, 1,000,000 small humiliations, and the sweet, intoxicating taste of revenge served at precisely the right temperature. The next 48 hours unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. Richard's desperate attempts to contain the scandal only fed the media frenzy. Every press release, every denial, every threat of legal action was met with another wave of revelation. Maria watched from the shadows as the man who had towered over her just days ago slowly crumbled under the weight of his own exposed corruption. "They're calling for his resignation," James Parker announced during an impromptu meeting in the employee break room, his usual corporate polish showing signs of strain. "The board has scheduled an emergency session for tomorrow morning." He glanced at Maria, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. His role as an inside informant had been crucial, driven by years of witnessing Richard's abuse of power from the executive suite. Jasmine kept close to Maria, running interference when reporters started sniffing around the service staff. "Girl, they're saying the company's stock has dropped 60% since yesterday," she whispered, her protective instincts on high alert. Richard's been locked in his office for hours, screaming into his phone. The screaming had become a constant backdrop to Maria's workday. Through the walls, she could hear Richard's increasingly desperate calls to his lawyers, his bankers, his political connections. But the evidence she had gathered was too thorough, too well documented to be dismissed. Mr. Chen had taught her the value of patience, and she had spent years building an airtight case. "Your father would be proud," Chen told her quietly as they watched the evening news in the kitchen. The coverage was relentless, former employees speaking out, financial experts analyzing the complex web of fraud, social activists highlighting the pattern of worker exploitation. Each new revelation was another nail in Richard's coffin, another vindication of her father's warnings about the corrupt system that had destroyed him. But it was the small USB drive that arrived on the desk of every board member that morning that delivered the final. Maria had saved the most damaging evidence for last, proof of Richard's personal involvement in covering up workplace deaths, of bribes paid to silence grieving families, of systematic discrimination that went far beyond casual cruelty. The security cameras captured the moment Richard finally broke. Standing in his office, watching his life's work disintegrate on every news channel, He hurled his crystal decanter against the wall. The shattering glass echoed through the building like a symphony to Maria's ear. Through the spray of expensive bourbon, she caught his reflection in the window. A man stripped of his armor, facing the consequences of his actions for the first time in his privileged life. As Maria cleaned up the broken glass, methodically and thoroughly as always, the realization that his downfall had been orchestrated by someone he had deemed beneath his notice seemed to age him years in moments. "You," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "All this time, it was you." Maria met his gaze steadily, her silence more powerful than any words. The mighty had indeed fallen, and she had been there to document every step of their descent. The dawn of the board meeting brought with it a media circus outside Winter's tower. Maria arrived early, slipping through the service entrance while reporters clustered around the main doors like hungry wolves. From her cleaning cart, she watched Richard's arrival, his usual strut reduced to a haunted shuffle, his designer suit hanging loosely on his frame as if he'd aged years in just days. Inside the boardroom, Maria methodically dusted the elaborate wooden panels, invisible yet all-seeing as board members filed in. Their faces were grim, folders thick with evidence clutched in manicured hands. James Parker was the last to enter, his expression unreadable as he took his seat at the far end of the table. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy as storm clouds before a hurricane. "This is a witch hunt." Richard's voice cracked as he tried to maintain his usual authority. "I built this company from nothing." But the evidence projected on the screen behind him told a different story, one of systematic abuse, of lives destroyed, of power corrupted. Maria's careful documentation played out like a devastating symphony, each revelation striking another blow to Richard's crumbling facade. In the kitchen, Jasmine monitored the live news coverage on her phone, providing updates in hurried whispers. "The SEC just announced a formal investigation," she reported, her dark eyes wide, "and 3 major shareholders have already pulled out." Mr. Chen worked silently beside them, his experienced hands preparing meals while his wise eyes watched Maria with quiet pride. Through the partially open door, Maria witnessed Richard's final moments as CEO. Effective immediately, the board chairman's voice rang out, "You are hereby removed from all positions within Winter's enterprises." Richard's face contorted in rage, then crumpled in defeat. As security approached to escort him out, his eyes found Maria once more, recognition and realization dawning in those cold blue eyes. But Maria's revenge wasn't complete yet. As Richard was led through the lobby past employees he'd belittled for years, a final news alert blazed across every screen. Winter's criminal investigation expands. Personal records reveal pattern of tax evasion and money laundering. The evidence she'd saved for last, delivered with precision timing to the FBI, would ensure that Richard's fall from grace was absolute. In the midst of the chaos, James Parker approached Maria as she polished the now empty boardroom's windows. "The board is implementing immediate reforms," he said quietly. "New worker protection policies, wage reviews, everything you documented." He paused, studying her reflection. "You've changed more than just one man's fate today. You've changed the entire system." As Richard's designer shoes clicked their final path across the lobby's marble floors, Maria allowed herself a small smile. Justice, she had learned, was indeed a dish best served cold, and she had served it with the same meticulous care she'd shown while balancing trays of champagne at that fateful gala. The aftermath of Richard's removal sent shockwaves through Manhattan's elite circles. Maria watched from her usual post at Le Chateau as the same people who had laughed at her humiliation now whispered about Richard's disgrace over their expensive wine. The restaurant had become a theater of schadenfreude, with former associates scrambling to distance themselves from the fallen titan. "Did you hear?" Jasmine murmured during their evening shift. They found offshore accounts in the Caymans. The FBI froze everything. The news brought no joy to Maria, only a quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally emerged. Mr. Chen, arranging plates with his usual precision, nodded sagely. "The highest tree catches the most wind," he remarked, "but even the mighty must bend to justice." The transformation at Winters Tower was swift. James Parker, now interim CEO, had begun implementing sweeping reforms. The cleaning staff received proper contracts, health benefits, and fair wages. The whistleblower protection policies Maria had dreamed of while gathering evidence were now company standard. Her father's photograph sat on her nightstand at home, his gentle smile seeming to approve of the changes his daughter had sparked. But the real story wasn't in the headlines or corporate memos. It was in the small moments of dignity restored. The single mother who'd lost her savings received full restitution. Throughout the city, others began coming forward with their own stories of abuse by powerful figures, inspired by the fall of one who had seemed untouchable. One evening, as Maria served at another high society event, she overheard a conversation that made her pause. "It's remarkable," a woman in diamonds mused, "how someone so seemingly insignificant could bring down an empire." Her companion nodded, swirling his wine. "Makes you wonder who else is watching, waiting, documenting." The weight of their words hung in the air as Maria moved through the crowd. She caught her reflection in a mirror, the same uniform, the same careful movements, but her eyes held a different light now. She was no longer invisible by circumstance, but by choice. In the kitchen, Jasmine squeezed her hand in silence, while Mr. Chen's proud smile spoke volumes. That night, after her shift, Maria stood outside Le Chateau, looking up at the stars barely visible through Manhattan's light pollution. A news alert buzzed on her phone. Richard had been indicted on multiple federal charges. The man who had once made her feel so small was now facing years behind bars. But as she walked home through the quiet streets, Maria realized that revenge, even justified, wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of something larger, a shift in power, a rebalancing of scales, a reminder that dignity couldn't be measured in dollars or social status. The real victory wasn't in Richard's fall, but in the rise of those he had tried to keep down. In the weeks that followed, Maria found herself at the center of a quiet revolution. Workers across the city began sharing their own stories of abuse and exploitation, finding strength in the example she had set. The movement grew organically, spreading through break rooms and back kitchens, from one service worker to another. But Maria remained in the shadows, her influence felt but her identity still protected. James Parker had transformed Winters Tower into a model of corporate reform. During one of their clandestine meetings in the service corridor, he shared the latest development. "The board has approved a worker representation program," he informed her, his usual corporate polish softened by genuine enthusiasm. "And the profit-sharing initiative starts next quarter." Maria nodded, remembering how her father had dreamed of such changes before Richard had destroyed his small business. The media circus around Richard's downfall reached its peak when he appeared in court for his arraignment. Maria watched the coverage on the kitchen television, standing between Jasmine and Mr. Chen. The once mighty billionaire shuffled into the courtroom in handcuffs, his designer suit replaced by a standard blue jacket, his arrogance shattered by the weight of his crimes. "Not so high and mighty now," Jasmine whispered, but Maria felt no triumph. Only a solemn satisfaction that justice had finally been served. Mr. Chen, who had watched the entire saga unfold from his kitchen sanctuary, placed a weathered hand on Maria's shoulder. "The greatest victory," he said softly, "is not in destroying your enemy, but in transforming the system that created him." His words resonated deeply as Maria observed the changes rippling through the service industry. Other restaurants had begun reviewing their labor practices, and several major hotels had implemented new worker protection policies. One evening, as Maria cleared tables at Le Chateau, she overheard a conversation between two corporate executives. "It's not just about Winters anymore," one said, nervously adjusting his tie. "The whole landscape is changing. The workers, they're watching everything now." Makes you think twice about how you treat people, doesn't it? Their words confirmed what Maria had hoped. Her act of revenge had evolved into something greater, an awakening of consciousness among both the powerful and the powerless. The USB drive that had brought down Richard Winters had also opened a door that couldn't be closed, inspiring others to document. In the kitchen that night, Jasmine caught Maria in a rare moment of reflection. "You did more than take down one bad man," she said, her dark eyes shining with pride. "You showed everyone that change is possible." Mr. Chen, arranging his knives with characteristic precision, added quietly, "And you did it without losing yourself to bitterness." As Maria walked home through the city streets, she passed the darkened windows of what had once been Richard's favorite restaurant. The sign announcing its closure also noted that it would reopen under new management, with its workers as part owner. She smiled, thinking of how her father would have appreciated this particular twist of fate. The revenge she had planned had become a revolution she had never expected, transforming not just one man's empire, but the very foundations of power in their world. The final chapter of Richard's downfall played out in a federal courtroom, though Maria watched it unfold through news reports rather than in person. The evidence she had gathered proved devastating. Years of financial crimes, labor violations, and criminal negligence laid bare before judge and jury. When the guilty verdict was read, Richard's empire didn't just crumble, it imploded. In Le Chateau's kitchen, Maria, Jasmine, and Mr. Chen gathered around a small tablet streaming the sentencing. 15 years, Jasmine whispered, gripping Maria's hand. Plus full restitution to all victims. The number seemed both massive and insufficient for the lives Richard had destroyed, but it was the judge's closing statement that resonated most deeply. Does not shield us from responsibility. Later that evening, as Maria served at another high society event, she noticed a subtle but significant change in the atmosphere. The wealthy patrons spoke in hushed tones, their attitudes toward the service staff markedly different. Gone were the dismissive gestures and casual cruelty. In their place was a new awareness, an understanding that the people serving them were not invisible. They were witnesses, potential documentarians of misconduct, holders of truth. James Parker visited Le Chateau that night, taking a quiet table in the corner. As Maria served his usual whiskey, he slid a folder across the table. "The board approved the final settlement package," he murmured. "Every worker Richard ever wronged will be compensated. And there's something else." Eyes, which she quickly blinked away as she maintained her professional composure. Her father's legacy would live on, not in bitter memories of defeat, but in positive change for future generations. Mr. Chen, observing from his kitchen domain, nodded in approval. "Your father's spirit can rest now," he said softly when she returned to the kitchen. His daughter has turned defeat into victory. Through the restaurant's windows, Maria could see the lights of Winter's Tower, now renamed Unity Corporate Center, glowing against the night sky. The building stood as a testament to transformation, its reformed policies and practices spreading like ripples through the corporate world. Other companies, fearing similar exposures, had begun preemptively addressing their labor practices and corporate culture. Jasmine, counting her tips at the end of the shift, shared the latest industry gossip. 3 more major restaurants had announced worker profit-sharing programs, and a prominent hotel chain was facing its own reckoning after employees followed. Maria's example of documenting abuses. "You started something bigger than revenge," Jasmine observed. "You started a movement." As Maria left work that night, she passed the courthouse where Richard's fate had been sealed. The building's stone facade reminded her of how far she'd come from that humiliating moment at the charity gala. Her revenge had been served not just cold, but with a side of systemic change that would outlast any individual's downfall. In the end, she had achieved something her father never could. Not just justice for one wrong, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power. In the soft glow of a winter morning, Maria stood in front of Le Chateau one last time, her resignation letter tucked carefully in her pocket. After everything that had happened, after all the changes she had helped create, it was time for her own transformation. James Parker had offered her a position heading the new worker advocacy division at Unity Corporate Center, a role that would allow her to continue fighting for change, but now from within the system. "You're really leaving us?" Jasmine's voice cracked slightly as they shared one final break together in their familiar kitchen corner. The space felt different now, brighter, more dignified. The new management had implemented all the reforms Maria had fought for. Mr. Chen, arranging his mise en place with characteristic precision, paused to place a gentle hand on Maria's shoulder. "Every bird must leave the nest," he said, his wise eyes glistening with pride. "But the lessons learned here will fly with you." He handed her a small package wrapped in kitchen towels, his personal set of knives, the ones he had used to teach her about precision and patience all those years ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on Maria. Like those knives, she had been sharpened by experience. The news of Richard's first day in federal prison had broken that morning. Maria had watched the coverage on her phone, the former billionaire shuffling through the prison gates, his empire dismantled, his legacy transformed into a cautionary tale. But she felt no triumph in his final fall, only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served, and more importantly, that lasting change had been achieved. James Parker met her outside the restaurant, his corporate polish now tempered by genuine respect. "The foundation is already making waves," he reported. "3 major corporations have reached out about implementing our worker protection programs." He hesitated, then added, "Your father would be proud of what you've built from the ashes of his dream." As Maria prepared to leave, she took one last look around the kitchen that had been her battlefield and sanctuary. The space held so many memories: the quiet conspiracies with Jasmine, Mr. Chen's gentle wisdom, the careful documentation of abuses that would ultimately bring down a titan. But it also held the seeds of something greater, a revolution in how power and dignity were distributed in their world. "Remember," Mr. Chen said as he embraced her goodbye, "the strongest trees grow from the smallest seeds." "You better come back and visit us," she demanded. "We're family now." Walking through Le Chateau's dining room one final time, Maria caught her reflection in the mirrors that had once made her feel invisible. The woman looking back at her now stood tall, her eyes clear and purposeful. She had entered these doors as a waitress seeking revenge, but she was leaving as something more, a catalyst for change, a voice for the voiceless. Outside, the morning sun caught the windows of Unity Corporate Center, making them shine like beacons in the city skyline. Maria's path led there now to continue the work she had begun, not in shadows and silence, but in the open, where true change could flourish. The revenge she had planned had become a revolution she would now lead, transforming not just one man's empire. The transition from Le Chateau to Unity Corporate Center marked more than just a change in Maria's career. It symbolized a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of corporate Manhattan. Her new office, ironically located on the same floor where Richard had once held court, now served as a beacon for workers seeking justice and representation. 3 more whistleblowers came forward this morning, James Parker reported during their morning briefing. "They're following your documentation model exactly." Maria nodded, reviewing the carefully organized files on her desk. The template she had created for gathering evidence had become a blueprint for workers across the city, a tool for transforming silent suffering into actionable change. Jasmine visited often, bringing updates from the service industry grapevine. "You wouldn't believe how different things are now," she said during one lunch meeting. "Even the biggest jerks think twice before mistreating staff. Everyone knows someone could be watching, documenting." Chen, who had begun teaching free cooking classes in the corporate center's new community kitchen, smiled knowingly from his station. The worker advocacy division grew rapidly under Maria's leadership. Each day brought new challenges and victories, implementing protection policies, mediating disputes, ensuring that the reforms weren't just on paper, but practiced in reality. The foundation bearing her father's name had already helped dozens of workers stand up to abusive employers, providing legal support and resources that would have been unthinkable in Richard's era. One morning, a young intern placed a newspaper on Maria's desk. Richard's face stared out from behind prison bars, accompanying an article about his failed appeal. The man who had once seemed invincible now looked small, his expensive suits replaced by prison orange, his arrogance shattered by justice. But Maria barely glanced at the photo. Her focus was on the future, not the past. "You've created something remarkable here," James observed during a late evening strategy session. The lights of Manhattan twinkled beyond her office windows, each one representing countless lives touched by the changes she had set in motion. This isn't just about preventing abuse anymore. It's about redefining the relationship between power and responsibility. That night, as Maria walked through the transformed corporate center, she passed the wall where photos of past CEOs once hung. Now it displayed a mural commissioned by the workers themselves. Scenes of dignity, justice, and mutual respect in the workplace. Near the bottom, almost hidden, unless you knew where to look, was a small image of a waitress holding a tray, her posture proud, her eyes determined. The revenge she had planned had become a revolution she now guided, but more than that, it had become a restoration of dignity, not just for herself or her father's memory, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of unchecked authority. The mighty had fallen, yes, but from their fall had grown something far more valuable, a new way forward, where power served justice rather than corrupted it. In the community kitchen, Mr. Chen continued preparing his meals, teaching his students the same lessons about patience and precision that had guided Maria's journey. The best revenge, he often said, smiling at his former protégé, is not in destroying your enemy, but in building something better from the ruins. And that, Maria realized, was exactly what she had done. Maria stood at the podium of Unity Corporate Center's main conference hall, 5 years to the day since Richard's fateful mockery at Le Chateau. The room was packed with faces both familiar and new. Jasmine and Mr. Chen in the front row, James Parker among the corporate executives, and hundreds of workers from across the city who had found their voice through the movement she had sparked. 5 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear. A single act of cruelty became the catalyst for change. But what started as one person's quest for justice has become something far greater. Behind her, screens displayed the statistics of their success. Workplace abuse reports down 70, worker satisfaction up 85, and over 200 companies adopting the Unity model of corporate responsibility. From his prison cell, Richard had watched his former empire transform into everything he had fought against. His recent interview in the financial papers had been revealing, not for his attempts at justification, but for his final admission. "I never saw them as people," he had said. "That was my biggest mistake." The quote now hung in the Worker Advocacy Division's office as a reminder of why their work mattered. Mr. Chen had expanded his teaching program to include not just cooking, but lessons in dignity and self-worth. His kitchen classroom had become a sanctuary for workers learning to document abuses and stand up for their rights. "The strongest spice," he would tell his students, "is courage." Jasmine, now managing Le Chateau under its worker-owned model, had turned the restaurant into a shining example of ethical business practices. As Maria concluded her speech, she shared a personal revelation that brought tears to many eyes. "My father once told me that change comes not from fighting the darkness, but from lighting candles that show others the way. What began as revenge has become a revolution of dignity, a transformation of not just our workplaces, but our understanding of power itself." The foundation bearing her father's name had grown beyond Manhattan, spreading its message of worker empowerment across the country. Other cities were adopting their documentation protocols, protection policies, and advocacy programs. The ripples of change that had started in one restaurant's kitchen had become waves, transforming the corporate landscape. James Parker, now permanent CEO of Unity Corporate Center, joined Maria on stage to announce their latest initiative, a nationwide network of worker advocacy centers, each equipped to support employees facing abuse and discrimination. "The future of business," he declared, "is one where power serves justice, not the other way around." Later that evening, Maria returned to Le Chateau, not as a waitress or even a customer, but as a symbol of transformation. The same mirrors that had once reflected her humiliation now showed a woman who had turned personal pain into universal progress. In the kitchen, Chen prepared a special meal, the same dishes he had taught her to serve years ago. But now they tasted of victory rather than submission. "You see," he said, placing the final plate with his characteristic precision, "revenge is like a fine sauce. Too much heat destroys it, But the right amount of patience transforms it into something extraordinary. Jasmine raised her glass in agreement, her eyes shining with pride for her friend who had changed their world. As the city lights twinkled beyond the restaurant windows, Maria reflected on her journey. The USB drive that had brought down Richard's empire was now preserved in the Unity Center's museum, a reminder that the smallest tools could topple the mightiest tower. But the real victory wasn't in what had been torn down. It was in what had been built in its place. The revenge she had planned had indeed become a revolution, but in the end, it had become something even more precious.